Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places about fly fishing in Ireland. This week's guest is someone I wanted to speak to for a while. Robert Gillespie is an incredibly experienced salmon angler and instructor, and having read his articles on his website robertgillespie.net, the depth of information and thinking that he brings to the sport is incredible. He is someone to listen and learn from. For this episode, we go into detail about Robert's background and career and focus on casting matters, philosophy and approach. And Robert tells me why he believes that the casting is the fishing.
Well, it was in the family. My grandfather and the father fished, and the father was particularly fanatical salmon angler, I'd say. and he also fished for brown trout and sea trout as well, but salmon was the number one thing. So we lived in the north, fished on the foil system a good bit on the Mourne and the Roe. And then he spent a lot of time in Mayo, but on the Moy system. And I suppose the best way to describe how dedicated he was to salmon angling was that he went in the 60s. He would drive in a Morris Minor from the north down to the field for opening day. So that's really how he was. Now in those days he was an all message fisherman. It wasn't just fly fishing. Everything goes as the way it was at the time anyway.
And what was the fishing like back then?
Well, in my estimation, it was a lot better, but the thing is, salmon goes through cycles and all that. There was a spring salmon cycle. If you read the Tony George, which sort of tapered off at the end of the 60s, and then after that, it was a growth period and it was autumn fish, but it's changed back towards spring salmon fishing now. So there's the fishing was better, and I know from my own time the fishing was better on the Moy. Things are changed, Now spring fishing is still good. The big runs of grouse and autumn fish. The autumn fish have just gone, So
because, as well, when you hear what's happening in terms of kind of the numbers, drastically reducing and salmon anglers in despair nearly, would you be kind of in that boat in terms of pessimistic about the future of it?
No, well, it depends where you're fishing. The Moy is still a very good salmon river, and it's good spring fishing and early grouse run, but I wouldn't go near it in the autumn anymore. It's not, it's not what you'd call the autumn river that it used to be. Yeah, that is, if you take into account, there's a difference between fishing for salmon in the autumn and fishing for autumn salmon. It's the same. When I was fishing on the Roe River when I was a teenager with my dad, there was, thousands of autumn fish. You'd see hundreds in a day going over a weir and a dropping flood and stuff like that, and they were all like sea lice fish, and some of them were even on the road on the Mourne as well. They call them copper fish and silver fish. If they came in bright silver with sea lice, but you'd get some that come in with like autumn colours on them, but it was like a shiny lilac autumn colour, and you get those on the Moy as well. We used to call them harvest fish on the Moy. They were coming in fresh from the sea with some colour on them, but as I said, is a metallic lilac colour, and then there was the other ones that looked like spring salmon to be silver, So those runs don't seem to be around anymore. And then on the Moy, there was a large growth run, a smaller growth run on the fin as well. They used to call them sharpen stones and all that. The 2-3 pound growths come in at the end of May, very early June, before the main growth run. And then the autumn fish were really just the later growths coming later, They weren't necessarily autumn salmon, but there was, I suppose, there was such a big growth run at the fringe areas, as you would call it, the early and the later ones. There was more of them. Now it's confined to the main run, just, and it's not what it was.
And I suppose for salmon anglers, then you really need to kind of be aware of the changes in terms of the salmon run and focus your efforts accordingly.
Yeah, as I said, the Moy is still holding up, especially the early fishing. But then everything's relative, The best way to put it is, you only get despondent if you've seen it before. It's very hard, for instance, to accept change of something for the worse if you know and have experienced it being better, because you're standing there thinking, this used to be this, I should have had this by now, or this should have happened by now. But a person who's a newcomer to the sport doesn't have that history or doesn't have that background, and a salmon is a very, wonderful fish, and even, to catch any and see them and stuff, it's really hits people in the soul. So if they have nothing to compare against, they're probably happy enough, and a lot of them are. So it's all relevant to your own outlook on the situation and whether you know that it was better before or not. I think, you
know. Growing up, then, Robert, did you make a conscious decision because you were spending so much time fishing that this was something you wanted to make a career out of, or did it kind of just happen by accident?
It happened more or less by accident, and I did a lot of fishing, and I worked self-employed, so I could fish a lot in the springtime and in the summertime on the Moy, and I did do that. And then it happened on the Deal River that I was fishing, and this man came along with a young guy with him, and I didn't know who they were, but he was fishing wrong, and he was fishing in the wrong places, and he said to me, "How did you get on?" This was on the 31st of March, so I had actually played to my feet earlier, what would have been the first fish of the season, about 10 pounds, and he fell off just was about to net it, and usually I don't say anything to somebody like that because I mightn't believe you. He was chatting and I said, well, I nearly had one, that was that, and then he went on fishing. So after a little while then, I did hook another one and cleared it, and he came up and he netted it. So anyway, he said, "I'm fishing with a young fellow all week, I haven't even seen the fish, that's the first one." And I said, "Well, if you don't mind me saying so, just explain, there's only 3 lies here, the water's the right height, you haven't got the right setup and all that." So I gave him the gear, set him up, told him where to fish, and I said, "We'll fish it in rotation." I said, "Don't fish anywhere else, because you won't catch anything anywhere else," because I knew the river very well. So anyway, to cut a long story short, about 3/4 of an hour passed, he got a fish then, and I netted it for him, and he was like over the moon, and I didn't know who he was, but it turned out that he was the general manager of Mount Falcon Hotel at the time, and I thought the guy was his son, but he was actually the grandson of the owner of the hotel. And basically he brought me down in the evening for a meal, just started talking about this, that and the other, and it sort of stemmed from there. He got me to do a little bit of guiding, and then the guiding, at that time now, you'd have to understand, I could fish freely myself, go where I wanted, when I wanted to, as my own, sort of just captain of my own ship. And you start guiding people and they can't fish right, and then you're kind of using up your time, and sometimes you're missing good fishing yourself. And then, I said to him, "Look, I'm not interested in this anymore. It's using up too much of my time, and I don't really need the money, and I'm just not interested, So then he offered me, he said, "Would you be interested to give you a full-time job?" Or sorry, give me a seasonal job. I said no, because what would it be in the winter? And he said, "If I give you a full-time job, would you do it?" So he offered me a full-time job with accommodation and food. So then I just took it. I was 24 at the time, so that's what happened. Well, you landed in a bubble that's very hard to describe. There was no overheads. In other words, you didn't have to pay rent. I didn't have to pay electricity. I didn't have to pay gas bills. Food appeared. Everything appeared magically. So I lived in this bubble for about 10 years. Then you could sell salmon at the time and get tips. And in the winter, I'd cut the wood on the estate for the fires, which was good physical work. I actually enjoyed that. I kept fit. And then I lived like that for about 10 years. So it was only when I got married that the real world then hit, and the real financial, try to get a mortgage, this, that, and the other. So, but it was good. I wouldn't change it for anything, because the fishing was very, very good. And you're on private fishing and stuff like that. So it was a good experience, a very rapid learning experience as well. Sometimes a bit about fishing yourself, but then every now and then, most guests don't know that much, but every now and then some people turn up that are genuinely, very experienced, and they'll show you things or do things, and you learn that way, So it was a good experience, I suppose, that way.
Tell me this, you've obviously fished all over Ireland. Is there any particular favourites? Obviously the Moy is one. Anything in Munster, any standout rivers for you?
Yeah, I used to fish on parts of the Upper Blackwater a lot. Some of the grouse fishing there was very good. Now, you're talking about back in the 80s and 90s. Then I liked fishing on the Nore in the autumn. That was very good, down at the Thomastown anglers. That was a lovely stretch of water, nice fishing. Really good at times. Met some nice people down there, and then I like fishing the Galway Wheel Pool. I haven't fished that for a while, but it's a good fishery, good spring fishery. Nice big river, big water, good for casting. It's a nice place. So then I used to fish. Sorry, we fished in Donegal a lot, obviously. But the Mourne is, I still like the Mourne, you know, it's lovely, lovely river. And it's holding up. You know, the Roe's not what it was, but the Mourne is a good river. And beautiful, beautiful river, you know, beautiful fly fishing river. I mean, you know, if you talk about casting, you won't be showing the locals in the Mourne too much of the casting, I can tell you that. they know what they're doing, yeah.
Speaking of casting, Robert, instruction, being a fly casting instructor has obviously been an important part of your development. I've just been reading on your website in terms of all your incredible qualifications. So obviously, is the instruction a big part of it for you from the casting perspective?
Yeah, it is actually. I like, obviously, fly casting. I would be happy to go out fly casting without actually going fishing, you know, just to practice fly casting, and often do. I mean, before I'd done those exams in America, I was already teaching what I did there for 18 years. I'd learned it in Scotland before that, and there was no difference after those certificates and before. In fact, I give them up since because I don't agree with the way they run their. They give several certificates up, you know. So anyway, there was no difference in the casting before than when I did those exams. There might have been a bit more practice for some of the specific tasks because it's in syllabus, but that's all. In other words, it's a fundamental technique that I learned in Scotland of Peter Anderson years ago, and then incorporated other stuff. And basically, whether it's single or double-handed rod, what matters is how the rod works, and you've got to adjust to that. And if you don't, then, you know, you can, don't get me wrong, you can go out and cast and fish. And I mean, this might seem strange to say, but there'll be people born, live, get a double-hand rod, single-hand rod, fly cast all their life, die and be buried, and never once in their entire life allowed a rod to unload itself without shocking it. And that might seem like a big statement to say, but you can see it. And I wouldn't even do it unless it was, you know, forced into it and shown and told and explained in great detail. And still, it takes time and dedication. And but once you feel that, there's no going back then. And then, you know, it's like you know, that's what the thing is based on, basically. And it doesn't matter then what cast it is or what rod it is. And once you realize how it works, that's what you do basically with any of them. You know?
You've written, Robert, that you've described fly casting as counterintuitive in many ways. Talk to me a bit about that.
It's subtle when you start off, but it's even more subtle than you think. You know what? Well, I started off spey casting, and we'd be double taper lines and fiberglass rods, roll casting on the Roe, spey casting on the Mourne, and then so the move in modern times from away from longer lines to shorter belly lines, Skagit and shooting head stuff and all that is commonplace. But it's easy to, how would I put it this way, it's easy to go from a long line casting, double hand, or even single handed or longer, you know, double taper lines, and move on to weight forward lines or spey lines and cast them well. But if you take someone at the beginning and they cast with a shooting head from scratch or a Skagit line from scratch, they will, I won't say they'll never be able to cast right, but they'll almost not do it right, because you can get away with stuff that you can't get away with the long line. You just can't get away with it. And sometimes I have people turning up for fly casting lessons, especially with single-handed rods. You think of one or two incidents and you'd have a 30-foot, you know, loop up the Stillwater line, for instance, and I'd say, well, I don't, you know, teach people with that. And so that one, I said, no, I'm not going to teach short line, short head casting. I said, you can choose to do that afterwards if you want. Because the problem is, if I teach you with that, you get into short stroke style and you won't be able to handle the longer stroke style. And that's how simple it is. And then you'll be stuck with a limitation. And to be honest, you shouldn't have any limitation. It's the same for double-handed casting, you know. No, I use shooting heads and I use Skagit lines, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And to use them right, and I've seen this so many times, you're better to learn how to cast, you know, a mid-belly length spey line, you know, 65-foot head spey line. You know, if you can cast that well, you'll handle all the other stuff, no problem. But you can't really do it right the other way around, you know. And that's my personal opinion. But I see it, you know, what you see, and that's one of the problems with seeing stuff. if you've been formally trained as I was, or then and you just learn this, learn that. Someone shows you stuff, and all you can see. Well, you can actually see then when it's not right either. It's hard. It's hard to. There's a bit of Chinese philosophy called about the seeing eye, and I mentioned that on my side as well. Once you see, you can see, and that's basically to do with the emperor having this painting, and he showed all his. Sorry if you don't mind, I don't want to be long-winded, but the emperor in China, who was benevolent, and he loved art, and he had this fantastic art collection. He thought it wasn't really fair that he'd have all the art to enjoy, and the population wouldn't. So he decided to send it on a tour around China, his provinces of China every year, so everybody, even the poorest people, could see the art collection of the emperor. And his favourite painting was in a gold frame, and it was of two bulls fighting in a meadow, in a river meadow or whatever. And so it was in a solid gold frame. So there was always like 4 Imperial Guards in that section, and there was Imperial Guards doing the tour. So anyway, one day they're in this little village, and a young fella comes in by himself, too young to understand all the protocol of the Chinese. Now he starts laughing at the picture. What a silly picture, So one of the Imperial Guards says to him, "What do you mean? What is it?" He says, "It's two bulls fighting." He says, "That's the emperor's favourite picture." He says, "Well, whoever painted that," he said, "knows nothing about cattle and bulls." And he says, "Why?" He says, "Well, their tails are hanging straight down." He said, "As if they were grazing in the meadow, even though they're fighting." He said, "They would never, ever fight like that. The tails would be curled up like a snake, or they'd be swishing around, He said, "They'd never be like that." So anyway, to cut a long story short, when the tour is over and they're back, and the emperor's talking to the Imperial Guard guys who he trusts, and he says, "Well, did the people enjoy my favourite painting in the gold frame?" And he said, "Well, yeah, they mostly did, but there was one comment, one young guy, cattle herder, and he told them, you see." So anyway, the next day then the emperor's out on a painting, and then he goes to his the guy who looks after all his paintings. He says, "Take that painting out of the gold frame and put the other one I like with the flowers, and put that one in." And he says, "Well, I thought it was your favourite painting." He says, "It was, yeah." But he says, "No, I can't look at it without seeing the flaw." He says, "When I didn't know, I couldn't see. I was looking, but I didn't see. Now I can look and see." He said, "So there's a flaw in it," he said, "and once I know it, I can never look at it the same." Now that's what the seeing eye is. And that's one of the problems of being an instructor, even though I'm saying this, and I don't mean a beginner instructor. It's one of the problems if you come from spray casting, let's put it that way, with longer lines, and you see people hitting, shooting heads, and they don't have to hit them, and they'll go just as well or even better if they don't, but they still do it, and there's a habit of doing it, and there's a lot of bad habits too, and they won't be cured. The only way they'll be cured is if you cast a long line. So that's all I have to say about fly casting. Well, I don't mean all I have to say. That's the main thing. Sorry.
I was going to say, do you think the development and the rise in popularity of Skagit lines and the shorter heads, it's a shortcut in many ways for people to be able to, because they're forgiving and because it allows you to overcome mistakes that...
Well, definitely it is. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and they can fish with them, and you can cast after a fashion with them. It's only if you get into fly casting as a thing, and you start to see, or if you see somebody else that's really, really doing it really right. Fortunately, I live in Foxford. So, sometimes you go out fishing. Jared Downey is there fishing or casting. Go out to Loch Cullen and stuff, and he's 6 times world champion. So. Or there's another guy that I gillied with, Michael O'Kane, and he's a serious caster, So, one of the jokes we have between us or between people, do you ever see anyone not shocking the rod, and just laugh? Because it's a serious thing to not shock the rod, very serious thing to be able to do it and still cast the distance and get the fly turnover. For instance, if you're not getting fly turnover, it doesn't matter how far you cast. It has to turn over and stuff like that, So there's a whole lot of things in it anyway. But years ago, I've seen another guy single-hand casting, Rory Costello, and he was as good as you'd ever see, So Ireland has really, really, really good fly casters. The best around, Not because I say so or think so, but because they've proven it on the world stage, So people are products of their environment. If you go fishing in Scotland, you'll be fishing on big rivers. You'll become a good spray caster. It's just, the Moy is a big river, Blackwater. Some, sure, different places. Corrib, big rivers, and it depends how much you do it, So, I mean, I'm not expecting everybody. Don't get me wrong. No, I'm not expecting everybody to be a world class fly caster or to be, But I would say that if you're the instructor, you should make it your business to be able to cast without shocking a rod or without forcing it or thumping it. That's what I would say, and to be able to be smooth and steady and maintaining tension and stuff like that. And then it's very graceful and very beautiful, and the feeling is good when you get it right, But as far as shooting head casting is concerned, I like spade casting with shooting heads, but I do not like underhand casting. And I can do it, and I did do it, and I've done it for years in the past, and I learned directly from Rory Anderson, but I just don't rate it at all. I think it's a nonsense, So, much better to use longer stroke casting, and that doesn't mean that longer stroke doesn't mean that you're reaching or forcing with top hand, or you're just creating a longer stroke. That's all, and that's how rods I feel myself personally should be used. So I don't want to be hitting stuff. I want the rod to flex and do it itself, to a certain extent.
What are the kind of common mistakes maybe you see from people, not absolute beginners, but maybe people who do a bit of fishing and they want to improve? For people listening to it, what are the kind of common mistakes that you see?
So common ones would be that the rod is pulled in front to the left with a double-handed rod, if they're right-handed, say, when they hit the rod, and that's very, very common. And the reason they do it is because if they don't do it because they've forced the line and they haven't set it up right and they're shocking the rod, the poly leader or leader or whatever it is, or the tip of the line will catch on itself. Whereas if you're actually casting correctly, you can keep in plane through the power stroke and dropping down after as the line rolls out. You should never pull it into your left-hand side, unless there's a reason. I don't mean never. I mean, if you were counteracting an upstream wind or there was a backwater on your own side or something, but I'm talking about in general, there's a difference between doing something out of habit, a bad habit, and doing something out of your own volition. But I mean, if you're not keeping in plane on the forward stroke and on the follow through, then you're making a mistake. Because the tension of the bottom leg, for instance, is necessary to get the fly to turn over. So anything that happens should be of your own volition. The other thing, the biggest mistake, is people working the rod directly in front of themselves and not opening out, not turning the shoulder back, not opening out the stroke on the setup. Another thing is hitting the back cast, rather than letting the rod, when the line breaks free from the water, the line's going to go back itself. You don't have to force it back. The rod's not going to stay bent. The line's not bungee cord. It's gonna go back. So there's lots of little things, but the main one would be overpowering. Tugging the rod back would be one, and I'm talking about spade cast now. And the other one would be the forward cast not being in plane and not being smooth enough. The other in single-handed casting, again, it's I would say the single most biggest problem in single-handed casting with every beginner is not making it through acceleration in the forward cast. But the second biggest one is dropping the rod tip behind during the power application. That's a really bad mistake, and it really opens your loop. And when you make a mistake, you have to do a whole lot of things to compensate for it afterwards. And one of the things people that drop the rod tip behind do, single-handed rod now, is they speed up the backcast because they want things to become an equilibrium. Because you've dropped the rod tip down behind, put the brakes on, basically, you got to go faster earlier so it all balances itself out. Whereas if you kept it going in the one overall direction, didn't allow the rod tip to drop, it would unload in the right direction, travel in the right direction, the loop would be tighter, and you could do it a lot easier without forcing it. So it's like the most subtle thing that I know of in the world is fly casting. I don't know anything more subtle than it. And even when you think it's subtle, that you've got some sort of handle on it, some guy will come along and show you something even more subtle, and you'll be amazed. It's a lifetime learning thing, but that's the way it is, and
do you think it's important, Robert, for people that, I suppose the danger is, you might start off, you get a lesson or two at the start, you get into your fishing habit, and you're going to pick up bad habits, obviously. And as a teacher of mine used to say, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. That, you need to kind of go for refresher lessons nearly every so often to kind of iron out any chinks.
Yeah, that's right. You do need to get checked that you don't regress, as you would say, or deviate down a sidetrack of yourself. I mean, one thing that I remember about all this is, some instructors turn around and say, "Oh, I tailor my teaching to the the natural way that the guy moves and all this, that, and the other, or what he's, And I always think that's a false argument. I've refused to teach people. The guy came up to me one time and said, "Look," he said, "I'm just going to cast the way I cast. You tell me which bits are good and which bits aren't, and I'll just go with that." And I said, "Well, no, I'm not going to do that." So he said, "You're not?" And I said, "No." I said, "No, in the past I did karate, so you went into Shotokan karate class." I said, "I didn't go up to the teacher in the Shotokan karate class and said, listen, I'll just fight the way I fight normally, and you tell me which bits are okay and which bits aren't, and we'll go with that." I said, and the reason I didn't say that to him is because he knows what I don't know, and I'm there to learn from him. And I said, when I was formally trained in flycasting, if I had said that to Peter Anderson or Andrew Jim, they'd have told me to go home. I said, like I'm telling you now, I'm not going to teach you that way. Either you learn it correctly or we don't bother. It doesn't matter to me. I don't care. But I'm not going to slobber around, So, you have to set a certain standard. Now, don't get me wrong either. After you do your karate and you pass your tests and all, you can fight whatever way you want after, but you still learn the basics.
You need a foundation, yeah.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and it's the same with flycasting. I'm not going to put up with someone making mistakes for the rest of their life. And somebody else might, but not me. It's just my personal thing. You know what I mean? I'm not going to deal with it. And you can't progress then if you're carrying with you some limitation, some limiting factor. That's basically what it all comes down to. If you want to sum it all up, is control over your own body. So if you've got an involuntary muscle movement, which is a habit that you haven't controlled, it's like somebody comes up to me sometimes and say, "Oh, you're like bottom hand dominant." I said, "Yeah, I do." And say, "Oh, I like 50-50." I said, "Well, show me a totally bottom hand dominated cast then." And they can't do it. And I said, "How can you make a choice?" I said, "Unless you could, I can make a choice. I can show you a completely top hand dominated cast with a tight lip and it'll turn over, and I can do it. I can show you, as much as it is possible. I mean, obviously your top hand is moving, but as to create stroke length and all that. But it says, as much as is possible, I can show you. I can open the top hand and show you the bottom hand dominated cast." Now I said, and I have said this several times, and it's common sense, it's logic. You cannot turn around and make a choice unless you can go from one extreme to the other. And then you've got your own volition to kick in there. And you can decide, okay, I'll do this, I'll do 80-20 or whichever way it happens to be. But at least you've given yourself the freedom of movement to make that choice. And until you've done that, it's like me saying to you, I prefer to fly helicopters than small planes. I don't do either, you know what I mean? So it doesn't mean anything if you can't do it. What does it mean? It only means something when you can do it, So
I suppose a lot of times people see casting as a means to an end, but
yes.
really for you, the sense I get from you is that it's casting is all part of the philosophy in terms of how you approach the fishing. It's all wrapped up in a bigger philosophy for you, and it's amazing the kind of depth of understanding and detail that you go into with it,
Well, yeah, Michael Benner I mentioned before came here and he was getting, I met him and I said, "Look, I ended up got him a job in my Falcon. So not that I was there at the time, but I introduced him. So, but anyway, he stays at my house here all the time in his time. But the point is, he used to ask me about the fishing. Fly fishing is fly rod. And I just said to him, because, some people say, "Oh, those guys are only interested in casting, not fishing." I always said to him, and he'd still say, the casting is the fishing. And he used to say, "What do you mean?" So people don't say that. I'd say, "Well, you'll find out over time. The casting is the fishing." I said, if you can't put your fly, if I give you a spinning reel and it was like half a spool of 30-pound liner and it was, as it went over the lip and couldn't cast more than 10 or 15 yards, I said, "Do you think you could fish efficiently with, worming or spinning?" No. And I said, "Well, unless you get the right angle, it's not a matter of just getting the distance. It's getting the distance at the right angle with the right sinking tip or the right tube or whatever, and it turning over. And. And I said, the better you can cast, the more fish you'll catch. That doesn't mean you catch them all at distance. Obviously, you get some with your feet, but you won't catch the ones, as Peter Anderson used to say, which he did. He said a lot of good things. But anyway, he said, funny, he said, I've often seen good casters catching fish lying close in, but I've never seen bad casters catching the ones lying further out. It's just so simple when you see it. Now, you know, as I say, you have to combine the both, you know. But eventually, you know, it took him about 5 years. He turned around to me and said, you know what? He said, you're right about that. I said, I know. At the beginning, you want to know this, that, and the other, and you think there's some magic bullet. No, but I said, the best thing is to be able to control the fly when it's in the water. The best control is, you know, from how you put it out there or put it in the first place. So no, don't get me wrong. You don't need long lines either. When you know, it's all right if you're fishing in the morning. You know, if you're down Strabane Anglers or somewhere, you know, then it matters. You know, or you know, different places on the morning. If you're fishing the Eastie and you have a shooting head and a small switch rod, you know, with 11-foot switch rod, so that's fine. You know, it's horses for courses. You know, I'm not knocking all shooting head casts or all short line or you know whatever stuff. And I mean, to say I use Skagit, but I mean I'm using it for a reason, where and when and how. And even when I use Skagit, I use a long stroke. I don't have it. You know?
Obviously, Robert, people can get you on flycastingmatters@gmail.com if they want to book a lesson, and also there's a wealth of information on your website, robertgillespie.net. Robert, I'm hoping we could talk again in the next few weeks when we can talk about tactics for salmon fishing on the Irish rivers and lakes, because there's a huge amount of information I still want to delve into with you. But for now, thanks a million for joining me, and we'll talk to you again.
No, thanks for having me. Thanks for asking.
My thanks to Robert Gillespie for joining me on this week's show, and to get in touch with Robert for casting lessons, email him on flycastingmatters@gmail.com. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also keep up to date during the week on Instagram, and I'll be back next week with another episode of Ireland on the Fly.